Hey, what's up? I got some more lore content for you guys. With my recent updated beginner's guide, I wanted to double down and make a full extensive deck building guide as well. If you are a newer player to Legends of Runeterra and would like to build your own decks from scratch rather than importing pre-made ones all the time, then this video is for you. I made sure to include solid tips so that no matter how much experience you have, there should be something to take away. So make sure to drop a sub and a like if you learned something new. My name is Tempo and I've hit Master Tier every season since the beta, even hitting rank 1 multiple times on the North American ladder, and I will be your deck building guide for Legends of Runeterra. Before we get into it, I wanted to quickly shout out my patron Shurakai. During our coaching sessions, we've talked a lot about deck building and it helped when making this video. Check out the link to my Patreon in the description if you want to support, get coached, or influence future videos. So moving right along to the first point I want to mention, and that is where to begin. Let's say, for example, you're going to start deck building from scratch, but you've also stumbled across resources to build pretty much any singular deck you want. Maybe this happened from farming Path of Champions before going to PvP. Whatever the case is, you need to select your starting point. Oftentimes in Legends of Runeterra, this is going to be a champion that you want to play around. Champions are the strongest cards in the game for their cost, and offer many ways to win. Each one has a level up condition to be met, and enhanced stats or abilities for doing so, which means your deck for the most part should support your champions. There are some caveats to this obviously, for example, focusing on keywords like elusive or overwhelm, or some other card combos that don't invest as heavily into champions. If you just want to play big overwhelm dudes from Noxus and Freljord, with champions filling in as strong units for your strategy, you can go that route as well, but I digress. After you've selected a champion, you're going to want to put in cards that support them. Exactly what this means will vary from champion to champion, but some quick examples would be if you want to play Shyvana, she needs dragons to do damage, so go up to the search bar, which is your best friend for this. Type in dragon and filter by all cards to see everything you have access to. You can figure out your second region and second champion with ease by doing this. Another quick example would be looking at champions that level up in the same manner, like Misfortune, Quinn, and Vayne. Final quick example, if you want to play something like Teemo, you need to type in Puffcap in the search bar and see what you have access to. Again, I can't stress this enough, the search bar is an invaluable resource for you. If your archetype doesn't have an obvious second region, for example Gwen, feel free to pick any second region and add another champion along with their support package and the generally good cards for your regions into it. But how do I know what cards are generally good, you may ask? Well, make sure to watch to the end of the video for 5 must-craft cards for every region, so make sure to get those right away. Moving on to the next thing to do. Most champions have support cards within their region to give you a starting point, so go ahead and fill your deck with said support cards. It's okay if you add cards you don't own, and it's also okay if you go above the deck limit. We're going to trim it down in a bit. Now the biggest thing we need to do is determine the speed at which the deck wants to play. Look at the units and spells we've added and take some mental notes. Do we see lots of early game units that try to deal direct damage and have high attack stats? Well then this might be best as an aggro deck which wants to play fast. Do we see lots of big late game cards and we just so happen to be in Shadow Isles or Freljord, which are the best regions to stall and play slow? Well, this can probably be played as a control deck. How about a balanced mana curve and the flexibility of early game and late game all in one? Looks like we can probably trim this down to be a solid mid-range deck. If you're playing a well-known strategy or combination of champions, you may already know what speed your deck is. For example, pretty much any unit-based Demacia deck will be mid-range, but I'm going off the assumption that you want to build from scratch, so dictating the pace of the deck will ultimately be whatever you want to make it. After the speed of the deck is determined, we want to figure out 2 or 3 win conditions of the deck, basically strategies that we can play towards to naturally net a win. If your champion leveling up puts you very far ahead of your opponent to the point where that pressure is enough to win, that is a win con. Think like Nautilus, Asol, or any of the other big boys. Let's say the second win con for the deck will be developing multiple units and using them to consistently win combat while protecting them with buff spells, naturally beating down the opponent. That will be the deck's second win condition. The third win con can be more situational and something to play around if it comes up, but you definitely want at least 2 consistent strategies, in case your first one falls through. Now that we see the win cons in front of us, it's time to trim the fat and take away cards that don't actively help us. We've determined we need our champions, and units to protect and play around. These are often early to mid-game units, that way we can develop them ASAP and spend mana in future turns to pump them up or use them to strike with spells, which means we need to reduce some of the late game cards because they will clog up our hand when we need our early dudes and spells. Now we need to make sure we have enablers and defensive options. Enablers help us push our win condition forward, like Confront, allowing us to pick which enemies to block us, enabling us to beat over the board and satisfy win con 2, which we just established. Defensive options are generally protection or removal spells that allow us to live long enough to achieve our win con. Since we're playing in Demacia and have strong units, our best removal is single combat. Side note, your removal will look different based on what region you're in. For example, Piltover and Zon has a lot of damage spells, so keep that in mind when deck building. Also, we're playing around our units and using them to beat down the board, which means we want buff cards to protect our dudes, so we're making sure Form Up is in here. How many protection spells you run will depend on the regions you're in, because some have way better protection spells than others, but you're probably looking at 4 to 6 being a good number. Here are some general rules to help finish your trimming. For simple builds, make sure you're running 6 champions and 3 copies of each, that way you can draw them as consistently as possible. I wouldn't recommend getting crazy with 2-2-2 or 3-2-1 ratios right away. Next will be how many cards of each kind to run. For the most part, you want to run 3 of a card if you're content with consistently seeing 2 copies of it per game on average. So your essential win cons, enablers, and defensive options will all be 3 ofs. You want to run 2 of a card when you want to see 1 copy of that card per game on average. These will be your situational cards like your 3rd win con, matchup specific cards like Explorers, or late game cards that are nice but you don't want clogging up your hand with multiple copies. And finally, you should run 1 of a card if you want to see it once every few games, if you're able to force draw it from deck with another card, or if it's incredibly situational. This will depend on the player, but I naturally avoid 1-ofs during deck building, and only run them when I'm literally forced to for some reason. Another random side note, if your deck has tons of innate draw cards, you can run more things at 2 of, since your chances of seeing them will be higher per game on average. Once you get your deck finalized, it's time to do some deck testing and take more mental notes. For the first few games, just try to play towards your win cons with little respect to what your opponent is doing. Focus on your own game plan. If you do this, you'll naturally win and lose some games while taking in passive knowledge. You'll get a feel for what regions, strategies, or specific cards tend to beat you just by focusing on your own win con and having it stopped by your opponent. Afterwards, take some notes and follow this questionnaire. Is my main strategy being pulled off but I'm still not winning? That means my win cons are consistent but not strong enough to close out. Time to adjust them. Is my opponent killing me before I can even get to my win cons? Well, time to add more defensive options to control the board. Is my strategy getting disrupted a bunch? Maybe invest in some spell shields or deny type effects if the regions allow. To round out this topic, here's a simple formula to plug your deck into whenever you build from scratch, or adjust one that you just imported. Make sure to pause and print screen so you can have this on hand, and drop a like while you're doing so. It helps other new players see this video. Here are some rapid fire quick tips for building decks of different speeds. Aggro decks tend to rely on swarming the board with early game units and closing out with direct damage. You are going to want 9 1-drops and probably around that amount of 2-drops as well, since you will be dumping lots of early game cards in the first few turns. Direct damage to the enemy nexus is also recommended. Aggressive skills, effects, or keywords should be prioritized, and you don't have to care about buff spells since you'd rather spend that mana on swarming with more units rather than protecting one measly one. When mulliganing with aggro, you want to go for 3 1-drops in your opening hand if you are attacking on even turns. That way you can dump all 3 and attack with them on turn 2. On attack odds, you want 2 1-drops and 2 2-drops for the same reason. Getting your damage down ASAP is key. I tend to mulligan away cards like Noxian Fervor because I want to draw it later when I'm trying to end the game. Mid-range decks primarily care about consistent pressure, so you're going to want around 6 1-drops in the deck. Bonus points if they have synergy or support your champions. That way you can get something on the board early, while also not drawing too many 1-drops throughout the course of the game. Then you want a healthy amount of buff cards, usually 4 to 6, so you can keep the pressure going and hurt the opponent by outplaying their damage with your buffs. Then you also want a balanced mana curve, with strong units to play on each round from turns 3 through 7, never letting up the pressure. If you have multiple champions of the same mana slot like Alawi and Gwen, do not have any additional units of that mana, otherwise it's going to hurt your hand consistency. When mulliganing, you want a variety of cards. A healthy balance of early units, spells, and one mid-game unit you plan on playing around is a good general strategy. Control decks care about stalling and playing slow. Oftentimes it's better to float early mana in favor of higher cost spells, so running 3 1-drops that have synergy is advised, or even no 1-drops at all. This archetype is going to care the most about removal, so make sure you have a variety of options ranging from 1 mana removal cards that do a little bit of damage, all the way up to big removal cards that kill everything. Early game units that can be used as low commitment blockers that generate you extra cards are also advised to be put in during deck building. For mulligan, you want to focus on removal and your main tools needed to win the game. Another deck type is called combo, which focuses on using a specific set of cards to win the game. This kind of deck can be of any speed, so make sure you follow the rules and focus on consistency of the combo above all else. And to round out the video, here are 5 must-craft standard cards for each region. These cards do not strictly need to be played in specific archetypes, they're just fine as standalone inclusions. Starting with Demacia, we have Form Up, Single Combat, Petricite Broadwing, Blocking Badger Bear, and Screeching Dragon. Freljord, Omen Hawk, Sky Splitter, Harsh Winds, Buried in Ice, and Avalanche. For Shadow Isles, Quietus, Soul Harvest, Vengeance, Glimpse Beyond, and Hate Spike. Noxus, Legion Saboteur, Precious Pet, Noxian Fervor, Pirouette, and Armed Acquisitioner. Piltover and Zon, Mystic Shot, Piltover Tellstones, Formula, Forge Chief, and Pharaoh's Financier. Ionia, Concussive Palm, Deny, Nopify, Portal Pioneer, and Unworthy Soul. Bilgewater, Make It Rain, Mirai Warden, Eye of Nagakaboros, Heavy Metal, and Shell Shocker. Targon, Pale Cascade, Cosmic Youngling, Sunburst, Guiding Touch, and Targonian Tellstones. Shurima, Rite of Negation, Quicksand, Forsaken Bakai, Aspiring Chronomancer, and Avenging Vastaya. And finally, Bandle City, Pytos, Conchologist, Otterpuss, Bird the Bell Ringer, and Skip King of the Reef. And that about wraps it up for the video. I hope I did a good job explaining how to build a deck from scratch, as well as adjusting ones that have been imported. Make sure to glance over the video again in case you get lost in the steps, and also recommend this video to friends. Remember, pick a champion, add support cards, fill the deck, determine the speed, determine win cons, add enablers and defensive cards, trim it back, and finally adjust the deck as you playtest. Hopefully the extra tips and must-craft cards helped as well. And that's it for this one. Please like and subscribe if you learned something new from this video. Make sure to follow me over on Twitch if you want to ask questions. I love giving extra context when I can. Also, support me on Patreon if I've helped you at all on your lore journey. Thank you so much for watching and have a good one. Laters.